Hello and welcome to the Civil Service World podcast. My name is Tevye Markson. I'm CSW's online editor and your host for today's episode, which is all about fostering mutual respect in public service. Now, unfortunately, we've probably all seen someone working in a customer-facing role not being treated with the respect they deserve by a member of the public. Many of us have also been on the receiving end of such abuse in our working lives. And we'll all be familiar with the posters and train stations reminding customers that behind every uniform is someone just like you, and other similar messages. Government departments recently got together to discuss how to safeguard frontline civil servants from abuse. To discuss this hugely important topic, I'm joined by two special guests, Myrtle Lloyd, who's HMRC's Director General for Customer Services and also the Chief Customer Officer. And I'm also joined by Causon, the Chief Executive of the Institute of Customer Service. Myrtle, could you give some examples from within HMRC of some of the abuse that frontline staff are having to deal with?
Unfortunately, I think this is a growing trend of customer behaviour across public sector as well as the private sector, and I'm sure Joe will be able to say more about that. In HMRC, we interact with customers in various ways. We've got them on the phones, via correspondence, digitally, web chat, and others. In our telephone service, we do get quite a few instances of abuse. Things like, racial abuse, sexist abuse, sometimes derogatory remarks, foul language. And we get some of it on, writing as well, and sometimes in our face-to-face, but it's much more prevalent in our phone interactions.
That must be really tough to deal with. How do frontline colleagues react to that sort of thing, and how are you helping them to deal with that?
I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I just want to say our colleagues do an excellent job, and sometimes in quite challenging circumstances. And I'm really proud of their professionalism, which is why, sort of when they encounter abuse, it is something that we have a zero tolerance for that in HMRC. So we've got wellbeing support for colleagues. We've got our employee assistance program. We have got mental health, sort of ambassadors and mental health advocates our colleagues can tap into. We also have means by which our colleagues can flag abusive behaviour, and that's how we gather the data. Unfortunately, sometimes our colleagues have got so almost a higher level of tolerance for abusive behaviour, so we know there is some underreporting of abusive behaviour happening as well. We have, of course, the best support for our colleagues is their line management and peer support that they get as well. So there's a number of interventions and support that we provide to colleagues. And at most, the more extreme cases, we can refuse to interact with the customer in a certain channel if it's very persistent and it's extreme. And where it gets to criminal behaviour, we do report it to the police as well. And if there is legal intervention to be brought to bear, we do bring our legal department in as well. So we try to support them all the way through from from the softer and peer support all the way through to taking it through to the legal process if required.
That sounds like a great moment to bring Joe in. Joe, could you tell us a bit about the Institute of Customer Service and how long you've been helping people with this sort of issue?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me along today. It's always good to be able to talk to you and to colleagues across the civil service. So just for a little bit of introduction, hopefully most of you know, the Institute is a professional body. We actually have memberships across a whole range of different industry sectors, including the public sector as well as the private sector. And I think that's quite important because it's the opportunity to learn from different sectors. And for HMRC in particular, at the moment, we are working on benchmarking using the UK CSI, our professional qualifications and wider policy work. But to this campaign particularly, we launched the Service with Respect campaign in the summer of 2020 in direct response to a significant increase that we were seeing in abusive behaviour across a range of different industry sectors. And we launched that actually at our all-parliamentary group. We now have the backing of over 370 organisations and cross-party parliamentarians. And the idea behind the Service with Respect campaign is to be able to put a highlight on the fact of this increase in abuse that we're seeing, to encourage organisations like Myrtle is talking about to report it, and to report it inside the organisation, but also to report it to the police. And we are also calling for a change in the law to make abusive behaviour a standalone offence, in the same way that we're seeing that go through Parliament at the moment for retail workers.
And how would you say the landscape has changed over that period?
Sadly, it has got worse. So what we've seen that over the last 6 years certainly hasn't got better. Our research has shown that 43% of customer-facing workers have experienced an incident of customer hostility in the previous 6 months. And that's a rise of over 20% year on year. So to Myrtle's earlier point, this is definitely on the rise. The impact of this obviously goes beyond the personal toll on individual workers. We're seeing across the board that 37% of customer-facing staff are considering leaving their jobs as a result of this aggressive behaviour. And 26% of those who've experienced abuse have had to take time off. So they've been poorly or sick as a result of that. And they're averaging 8 days sick each time. So there's the obvious cost that you are seeing to those individuals, but the wider costs across the business, productivity cost, because obviously people are not working too. So this is a really big issue and something which we need to lean into and actually address. Just another point too, we did have a bit of a win, I guess, back in 2022, where we did see alleged change, which was making this level of abuse an aggravated offence for assaulting a public-facing worker. So that's good to see that, but we really need to shine an even stronger spotlight on this, which is why we are asking in particular for a standalone offence.
So could I ask you a bit about how you work with government departments like HMRC on this?
So we have a whole host of set of advice and ways of de-escalating these particular issues or challenges. And we can have that freely on our website and work with Myrtle and the team on that, because de-escalation is an important point. Myrtle's also talked about the fact that actually no member of staff should really have to put up with this. So the ability to, be able to correct the individual or say, I'm going to hang up or I'm not going to deal with this, we feel is a really strong point.
As I mentioned earlier, government departments came together to discuss best practice on this issue. I understand both of you were heavily involved. What were your takeaways from the event?
It was an excellent event, an example of what happens when organisations come together from a whole range of different sectors and boundaries to tackle that shared challenge. And I think that's the really important thing. I think a key takeaway was the commonality of the challenge. So whether you're in HMRC or behind a bar, serving somebody or installing broadband, the patterns of abuse are strikingly similar. And so are the solutions, therefore. And it's a huge opportunity, I think, for the public and private sectors to learn from each other. And I know that came out. And the importance of reporting for me, making sure that we are absolutely reporting these incidences. Staff don't always report incidents because they feel nothing will change or because they've normalised the situation. This is something that they feel that they've got used to. So creating a culture where reporting is encouraged and acted upon is absolutely fundamental in our belief.
Absolutely, I concur, Jo. I thought it was a really good event. I was struck by the similarity. One of the key takeaways for me as well was the stepping back and thinking about what are the drivers of that kind of behavior. And the recognition that there are human beings on both sides. There's a human being providing the service and there's a human being consuming the service. And we all come to those interactions with whatever other things that are happening in our lives. So it's that recognition, but also saying that when we get together, there is mutual respect and there's some professional standards of behavior that's expected on both sides of the coin. So in HMRC, what we're investing a lot in is also understanding almost, from a customer standpoint, we're looking at interactions from a customer events perspective. So helping our colleagues also understand that at the point at which a customer has a contact with us, there's a whole lot of other things that may be happening in their lives. So therefore, that kind of recognition And then how do we de-escalate, but be very clear that when boundaries and lines have been stepped, that they have the support that they need and they can call it out and they can terminate that call and they will be supported. And I think at the heart of all of this is how do we get to a point of, just delivering really, really good customer services and consistent customer service, because people get frustrated when we don't say, or we don't do what we say, or they don't get the service that they expect. That does not excuse the behavior, but that's something that we are also working on to say, how can we give really excellent, consistent customer service? How can we understand people's circumstances? And in doing so, how can we use our judgment and help de-escalate the situation? Or where we're not able to do that, how we provide support to our colleagues.
I think you've raised some really important points, actually, Myrtle. And I would just add, on that particular event, I think it also demonstrated, and what you're talking about now, reinforcing the fact that leadership commitment really matters. I can definitely see that. And when senior leaders visibly prioritise the issue, it sends a really powerful signal to the front line so that they don't have to put up with it. But also, and I'm sure we'll probably come on to this question, your point about mutual respect, between the customer and the colleague, I think is really, really important. You can't deliver excellent customer service if people feel unsafe or undervalued or burnt out with dealing with that level of hostility. So it is absolutely, you need both sides, don't you? You need a good customer and you need a good colleague in order to be able to deliver that customer experience.
Jo, could you tell me a bit more about the idea behind championing mutual respect?
So I think the principle for me is very straightforward. It's really what we're talking about now, which is respect flowing in both directions. So organisations have a responsibility to deliver good customer service. That's a key part of whether you're in the public sector or the private sector. And actually, in the public sector, the onus is possibly even bigger because we don't have a choice as a customer. But on the other side of that, so what we're saying is if we're delivering as organisations for our customers, we need to be professional, helpful and accessible service, do what we said that we were going to do. But customers also have a responsibility to treat the people that they're serving them with basic dignity and respect. And that's what we mean by this mutual championing, mutual respect on both sides. I think once you have that, it just becomes a much better and easier conversation, doesn't it? It's not about having a poster on the wall. It's a genuine commitment from the leadership that inappropriate behaviour will not be tolerated. And there's a big difference between you and I getting a bit grumpy because we've been in a queue for a little while, or, that's one thing. But what we're talking about here in terms of the Service with Respect campaign is its worst excesses of that. But there is something you can do, which is this championing mutual respect on both sides and understanding you've both got a responsibility in helping that relationship. But as I said, it doesn't excuse the very worst cases of abuse.
One of the things that can make this a bit harder in the public sector is that obviously you have this obligation to the customer, whereas in the private sector, you can opt out. What sort of unique challenges does this create?
I think for us, and as Jo said, for private sector organisations, customers can vote with their feet, or organisations can choose to target different groups of customers. It is different for us in the public sector, in as much as there isn't anyone else for people to go to. I see that as a huge privilege. Our colleagues, most of them who join the civil service join because of that public sector ethos, because they believe that they are there to help make citizens' lives better in whatever service they are providing. So it's really tapping into that piece around our contribution is more than just that transaction. Our contribution is, as public servants as a whole, is about changing people's experiences and changing their lives for the better. And I think the other bit for us to think about is we are also, in many cases, both the providers of the service, but also consumers of the service as taxpayers or or other public services. So we wear two hats. getting that level of empathy and that understanding and the appealing to our higher purpose for us as public servants is a way that we help encourage, sort of our colleagues to really be focused on, the customer immediately in front of them and their needs and how best to satisfy their needs and drive the right outcomes.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, Myrtle. I like your point too about it being a privilege to work in the sector. And also, when customers don't have choice, it's almost like there's a bigger responsibility for us to be able to deliver that. But it does create quite a unique power dynamic, which I think, it would be wrong of us not to kind of face into. Because if the customer has no choice, that can cause frustration because they can't take their business elsewhere and they sometimes feel trapped. And frustration can escalate more quickly because of that. Whereas if I'm in the private sector, if I don't get the service I expected, I can probably choose, if I'm buying a dress, to go somewhere else or that part. So for me, it means that we need to be in the public sector even more thoughtful about how we design the services. If a process is confusing or a system goes down, if wait times are unacceptable, customers can't walk away. Therefore, that can escalate, as we were talking about, the frustration. But, and this is the other important side of this, nor can those people working in the public sector, because there's a legal and a moral obligation to continue to provide that service. So this is why I think this mutual respect and understanding is so important. And also, let's be honest with you, I think everybody that works in the public sector about the higher purpose, wanting to make a great outcome for the customers that they are serving. And they are often serving some very challenging and vulnerable customers too. And I think that's another thing that we need to recognise. And then that goes back to what training we are giving, what approach we're doing to de-escalation, and how the leadership, which is what Myrtle's ably demonstrating here, is taking this issue really, really seriously. So it is a challenge, is what we would say, but actually a great opportunity. And the other bit of this is that there's the social aspect. So it's not just about improving the experience for your customers or your colleagues, but actually a productivity issue. I touched on the issue of sickness, but actually if we have to keep repeating things, if we have to keep repairing things, there's a cost. So, getting this right and getting it right first time is a really important part of that. Managing and having good conversations and dialogue with our customers is another important part. So this matters, I guess, not just in terms of this campaign and in terms of the individuals, it matters across the board to help us to be able to deliver better services more generally.
So let's come to legislative change. Could that make a difference?
Well, I think it's a really important question that you've asked because, if we think about in terms of society, there's been massive change going on. We've gone through Brexit, we've gone through COVID, and we've now gone through a significant cost of living. And we're living in a time when there's a lot of uncertainty. So there's quite a big societal challenge. And the service agenda for me is a really good way of uniting people. Because, at the Institute, we talk about our third pillar, which is service for good. What we see is when we deliver service across the UK, we're a service nation. So 80% of our GDP comes through service and 60% of our workforce work in some form of customer-related role. So if we can really focus on the importance of service, I think that will really help raise things and hold each other to account a bit more about our behaviour. Now, having said that, and you asked about what sort of legislative changes could help with that. At the Institute, we would like to see a greater spotlight put on this from a legislative point of view. So we've got the Crime and Policing Bill that's currently moving through Parliament at the moment, and there will be a standalone offence for assaulting a retail worker, which we welcome as part of that. But I would actually like to see that protection to cover all people in customer-facing or public-facing workplaces. Because I think it sends a really important message that actually this sort of behaviour is not tolerated. So it's not about sending more people to prison. It's much more about it being a deterrent. And, when we think about that, that puts a bit of a spotlight on that. And then that should encourage us as customers and consumers to think about our behaviour a little bit more and to understand there's a consequence if we continue to behave in that way. So I think there's a wider societal point. which is how service can actually really drive our economy, helps with productivity and being a force for good, if you like. And then there's the legislative point here, which is for me about making sure that anyone in a customer-facing role, in a public-facing role, feels protected and that we are doing the right thing by our people.
Just finally, Myrtle, where do you see technology playing a part in this?
I think that technology has quite a big role. If you think about technology will help us giving better service. Certainly in HMRC, our transformation roadmap is very much a technology-enabled, very ambitious technology-enabled roadmap, at the heart of which is how are we going to use technology to drive better outcomes for our customers and to help us, in our core purposes of collecting the revenues that fund public services. In this area in particular as well, we will be, I think the technology we will be investing in the next few years, it will also help us to get a better understanding of our customers. So the insights into customer sentiment when they're contacting us, the insight into, sort of customer behavior and where it is in our services that's causing frustration, that will all help us continuously improve and tailor our services to be much more personal for the customer. And I think if we take away some of the friction that either poor services or services that don't meet customer interactions, if we take away those, one of the root causes of creating tension is either lessened or, sort of removed altogether. And then, of course, the technology to help the reporting of the instances where there is abusive behavior, if we can make it easier for our colleagues to report, because right now I think our systems are not as intuitive and it takes a little bit of effort from our colleagues' part as well to report the incident. So we can use the technology to make the reporting much more slicker, then we're able to get better data and be able to target our interventions in the right place.
This has been a really interesting conversation. I think big issues to deal with, but a lot of reasons to be optimistic. Thank you to Myrtle. Thank you to Joe. Thanks to everyone for listening. Please do subscribe to the Civil Service World podcast to keep updated on the latest releases, and see you soon.